I'm just letting you know before we get started.
Okay, we are rolling.
Okay, first can I have you tell me your name, state, and spell it for me?
Yes, Harry John Psomiades. P as in Peter, Psomiades.
Okay, great. And let's get to that first question that we talked about during, when Turkey called for the mobilization. Why weren't the Christian men, most of them, given weapons?
Well, initially, when they first called, they in fact were trained and given weapons. But that policy immediately changed once Turkey entered the war, or as war was approaching, and they were disarmed and put into labor battalions.
Well, what happened to them when they were in those labor?
Well, the average life of a person in a labor battalion was 3 months. They were put to make roads in eastern Anatolia in the middle of winter. So they had the problem of the weather. They had the problem of not enough food. And it was one way, it was a slow death. And for that reason, you had all of these Christians going AWOL and going up to the mountains, not so much in terms of, resistance, but simply to save themselves because they knew once in the labor battalions they were finished.
Now, what about those men's families? What happened to them?
Well, what happened, it depended on who they were. If they were the bread earners, then they had a difficult time. But you have to realize at that time they were taken care of by relatives and by their neighbors. So there was, by the church, some survived and some didn't. But of course, it was a great loss to them, but they were taken care of basically by their own people.
Okay. What about the Pontians? How did they react during the deportation?
Well, they reacted in several ways. Some of them refused to be deported because for them that was sure death, and so they went to the mountains. Others just fled the country and went to Greece or to Russia, a lot of them to Russia because it was close by. And most of them were assured, and one always hopes that somehow, nothing bad's going to happen to you. We just have to move the men out for the time being, and you'll be taken care of. But as we know, more than half of the deportees died. Initially, it was only men, but then it was women and children. And for some reason, the great powers weren't so concerned about the men being deported. But the minute the women and children were, they made a lot of protests to the Turkish government. And the response of the Turkish foreign minister, Yusuf Pasha, basically said, he said, we only deported, because first he said we don't deport women and children. Then he said we only deport women who were acting against the state, who were in the state of rebellion, who were assisting the rebels or the deserters. And then, of course, we couldn't leave their children behind. They had to take their children with them. So, yes, they were children, along with the women being deported.
Well, and then let's talk about the difference between then the Young Turks policy and the Kemalist movement.
Well, I don't really see much of a difference at all between either one of them. They were both Turkey for the Turks. They were both determined to eliminate their minorities one way or the other, or to assimilate them, or to Turkify them one way or the other. We usually think because, well, let me backtrack a bit. We tend to, because we don't want to offend the modern Turkish state, we blame all of these terrible things that happened solely on the Ottomans. And we say, well, that was the Ottoman Empire. It had nothing to do with the new Turks. The Ottoman Empire, the last years, were run by the Young Turks. And in fact, most of the intellectuals and most of the senior people within the Kemalist bureaucracy came out of the Young Turk movement. And so, but But basically, we put all the blame on the Ottomans, and that somehow or other absolves Kemal. But no, he was equally, although, one can hear statements that he made to foreigners that he said, don't do these terrible things and so forth and so on. But, it was all done under his watch. He's responsible. And a lot of people died during the Kemalist period because they were in control of Asia Minor. And surely they had some responsibility. Now, their response very often is that, well, they were bandits and there was no law and there was really nothing we could do about it and so forth. But that's rationalizing their position.
Right. Well, then let's talk about the Turkish people today. How many actually know about this genocide and how many actually recognize it?
Well, the problem is, of course, that, first let me say that Turkish people today, and even the Turkish people then, were not bad people. But they've been socialized, and as long as all Turkish governments have denied this thing has occurred, they've been socialized through their educational system, by their leaders, by their mullahs and so forth, that these things never happened, this is a conspiracy, and so forth. So the average Turk that you meet, if you talk about it, he gets very upset, says never happened, and so forth. He really believes what he's saying, because he's been socialized in that situation. So I don't blame him at all. And the only way that's going to change, and that's why genocide has to be recognized wherever it is, because if you don't recognize it and you allow time to go by, the people and their descendants who were involved in the genocide simply will deny it ever happened. And so there has to be, it's going to take a long while. There are many, I'd say the majority of the Turks today they're not going to change their minds because of the socialization process. What the future is to change the textbooks and get the kids in elementary school and beyond and tell them, look, these things really happen. And that's all we ask. They really happened. They were terrible. The people who were involved in this were terrible. But of course, we had nothing to do with it. And let's admit the darn thing so it won't happen again, and let's move on from here. And that's all that people ask, is recognition that it happened.
Well, then why do you think they are still denying it, and what do you think the long-term effects of this will be?
Well, they're denying it because nobody wants to be under the shadow that, his grandfather was a murderer or something like that. Secondly, they're denying it, particularly the Armenian genocide, because if they agree that it occurred, then technically, in a way, I assume the Armenians could, or their descendants could say, hey, all these properties of ours, there has to be compensation. Whereas this is not the case with the Greeks, because with the Greeks there was a formal population exchange agreement which eliminated all possibilities of me going and saying, that's my grandfather's house and I want recompense for that. I can't do that because there's a treaty signed between Greece and Turkey that says you can't do it. And there's no such treaty with Armenia or Armenians. And so I think, they don't want the reputation that they were one of the countries, but a lot of other countries today that we think of very nicely today, we all have some dirty linen in the closet. And I think it's best to recognize it so that it won't happen again. And the second thing, I think, is they're afraid they'll get a bill for billions and billions of dollars. Anyway, there may be other reasons, but those are two certainly salient ones.
Well, how about the people that actually went through this genocide, that experienced this? How were they affected, and, how could they move forward?
Well, the people that, let me tell you a story, and I guess it's best to do that. My parents are Pontians, and they came as refugees to America. I was born and raised in Boston. My father had a tailor shop, and I used to go there after school to help out in the store. And he had a lot of friends coming to the store like they all do and socialize while they're working, and there was an Armenian gentleman that would come, and he was always drinking and always crying. Well, this man, I learned from my father, had, before his very eyes, his parents had been massacred. And for him, he was really committing suicide in a way. Do you know, for example, that a very high percentage, it's hard to give numbers to it, but a very high percentage of the refugee population, or let me put it the other way, the refugee population had a higher percentage of suicides than the Ndopi, than the native population in Greece. And so when we think of the number of people killed, 500,000, 600,000, a million, whatever figures you want to put on it, you also have to include all these people whose lives were destroyed, who got out and came to Greece or Armenia or wherever they went as refugees. But many of them, their lives were destroyed already psychologically. Quite a few committed suicide. But, you know, most of them made it. They somehow or other survived. And that's the nature of life, and they move on. But obviously, it had a horrendous impact on the survivors, no question about it. They too are the victims.
And my last question for you, going back, why were these people relocated? What was the point of that?
Mean the deportations? Why the
Yeah, what was the
deportations?
point? Yeah.
Well, I'll give you the official reason for the deportations, where they might be an invasion from the north. First, it was the Russians, because and before the Russians became the allies of Turkey. And then they said there might be, as I gave my lecture today on the bombardment of Samsun, that the Greeks might send a whole fleet and land on the coast, and there was a danger. So we have to get them away from the coast. The other reason for, these are, I think, the reasons they give. The other reason they gave is that because the Samsun area and Pontus generally was the area where most, aside from the Mediterranean ports, the supplies from Russia were coming basically through there. And they wanted to get rid of deport the men for two reasons. One, so that they would not in any way influence the movement of these supplies, and two, so that these families would not give support to the Greeks in the mountains who went AWOL because they didn't want to go to the labor battalions where they were going to die. The basic reason was, and they knew it very well, deportations meant death for a lot of people. The other reason they wanted to deport them was to take their properties, because the minute they were deported, because there was supposed to be, they were told essentially you'll be deported, then when it's all over you can come back, your house and everything will be there. But the very next day that they were deported, their houses were broken into and taken over, either by Turks or Muslims who had left the Balkans or Russia and came to Turkey. They were looking for a place to live. They broke in. All the local Turks were, you know, if it was a nice house, they grabbed it and moved in. Even the Turkish government got to a point and said, hey, you guys are taking, we need that to sell it in order to help to pay the war effort, because the nationalists had high taxes. They had to in order to support this government that they had. The Turkish, basically, then let me reduce it to two. The Turkish position was deportations were necessary for the security of the Turkish state. And what's not said, but it's equally true, deportations were used simply to demoralize and destroy the minority population. So either way.
Great.
Okay.
I think we're done. You're off the hot seat. What title can I give you?